what we're going to do, we're going to hear from our speaker, then he and I will sit down up here and do an interview, asking some questions, after which we will open up the floor to Q&A from all of you. How a media assault on Israel fueled a war on American Jews. Jonathan Tobin has spoken here before, some 16 years ago, or 12 years ago, when I was bringing in people who were really important from the media from Israel, and also who comment on local politics as well. Jonathan is a journalist, but I mean, he's a journalist. We don't have many journalists now. We have people who get filled with what to think, not how to think, in universities around our country, and those that go into journalism have just a tad of bias from what they had been spoon-fed. Jonathan is a true journalist, and Jewish News Syndicate was originally started in Boston by a couple of men who I happened to be friendly with, and I gave a contribution at that time to this fledgling news service, which now over the years has become probably the most trusted news service coming out of Israel and coming out of this country about Israel and what's going on in the Mideast. He's editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, which is now being called the Jerusalem News Syndicate, a senior contributor to the Federalist and a columnist in Newsweek, and a contributor to many publications. He covers politics, foreign policy, U.S.-Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, the Jewish world, and the arts. And he saw, what was it last night?
Guys and Dolls.
He saw Guys and Dolls last night. We had a lively discussion about that. He hosts his own podcast, Think Twice, a weekly video program, and the Jonathan Tobin Daily program. I can go on. He was graduated from Columbia University. What can I say? Things have changed a bit since he's been there. But please welcome a true journalist, Jonathan Tobin.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. I'm forced to get that very fulsome introduction. I'm forced to recall the standard speaker's line that if my dear parents of blessed memory were here to hear it, my father would have enjoyed it and my mother would have believed it. It is my pleasure and privilege to come back every year. I was here in the summer of 2014 when I think this building was new. I'm very honored to be back here, to be among you again, and to share a few of my thoughts about the media, how it impacts our current crisis of anti-Semitism, and I'll look forward to your questions at the end of this. Let me begin with what used to be a very common Jewish joke. It's a little outdated because it speaks of what is the quintessential Jewish telegram. Now everybody here is too young to recall what an actual telegram was. It was, if you want to know, just like look at one of those old movies on Turner Classics. They often deliver them in old movies. And basically it was a text, basically typed out on a piece of paper that somebody delivered in person, often with, good or very bad news. And the old Jewish joke went that the quintessential Jewish telegram read as follows: start worrying, details to follow. And as much as telegrams are no longer with us, I think that sort of spirit of Jewish communication really is still with us, and perhaps no more timely now than it has ever been. because we truly are in the middle of a crisis of anti-Semitism, not just a crisis in terms of war in the Middle East, but in terms of a crisis here for American Jews. I think we are experiencing an upsurge of anti-Semitism that is unlike anything that we've experienced in this country before, much as things were not always perfect. My thesis for you is to try to understand where it comes from, how we can approach it, and what we can do, if anything, about it. And in sharing my thoughts about the media, I'll start by acknowledging something that often comes, and it's sort of politically correct to begin any address by acknowledging your privilege. And my privilege as the editor-in-chief of JNS is that, unlike most people in the media these days, and I say these days, my privilege is that I'm being paid to tell the truth. I'm not being paid to give you any political bias. I'm not being paid to sort of slant things. My publishers actually want me to be as straight as we can. And sometimes people interpret that as bias because we're in such an era when bias has become so deeply ingrained in our culture, both as a media culture and throughout the rest of society. And more to the point, it is something that transcends politics. We're in a very hyper-partisan era. We all know that. Everything is about Republicans and Democrats and what you feel about the president. You hate him, you love him. What you feel about other politicians. And I want to preface anything I say tonight by saying that this is not about politics. This is actually not about partisanship, and shouldn't be. And it shouldn't be interpreted in that light, because this transcends the petty disputes between politicians with they come with an R or a D after their names, and their ambitions and how they seek to advance themselves. This is something that has impacted throughout our society. We can argue about which sectors it has affected more thoroughly, but it is something that is about everything that we do in our country right now, and it's therefore all the more important that we address it. And I would say that this is a pivotal moment in Jewish history and the history of the West in general, because so much of the discussion about anti-Semitism starts with how it is discussed in the media. The media frames our discussions, for good or for ill, about so many things. The media has changed remarkably during the course of my lifetime. The news used to be what 4 middle-aged white guys said at 6:30 p.m. every night. I see some heads nodding, some of you remember that too, or what 1 or 2 editors of newspapers in any given city said was news. Today it's the Wild West. Speaking in the Wild West, the news media is more than just a few television channels or cable channels or a few newspapers, national ones or local ones. It has changed. It is about not just websites, it's about social media. That is, as we say in the media business, where the eyeballs are. And as a result, there's good things and bad things about that. The good is that it is more democratic, in that it isn't just what a few people say. The bad is that the news is what anybody says. And indeed, the whole idea of gatekeepers, of somebody who would have the experience and the knowledge to be able to sort out the nonsense from the actual news that you need, which is the lifeblood of any democracy, and certainly has always been of our republic in this country. That's where we are. And when the media becomes corrupted by, not merely bias, because journalists have been biased since 1776. I mean, since the beginning of the American experiment in democracy. And in fact, bias in the 1790s was as vicious as anything today. But we're talking now about a specific kind of bias that has had an impact on how we as Jews operate in this society. And that's what I want to address. Because we are now in a situation where post the October 7th massacres, These ideas about anti-Semitism, what generates anti-Semitism, have migrated from the margins, from what we used to call the fever swamps of our society, to the mainstream. It has become normative. People can get away with things that they never did before. Just pull one example out of the air. The New York Times published a piece, which even many in its own staff disavowed privately and then sort of semi-publicly, which alleged that Israel had trained dogs to rape Palestinian prisoners. Something that is pretty much a physical impossibility, and for which, even if you could grant the premise, absurd as it was, you say it was possible, they had no proof of it. And all of the sources were biased sources against Israel. Yet that was published in what we once would have considered to be the newspaper of record in this country and around the world. And it is still probably the newspaper in this country with the most resources. And although it is no longer even aims at a broad audience, it is still very important. And we have to ask ourselves, how did that happen? And it's not just one biased journalist or a few biased journalists enabling them. It's about something that has happened throughout our culture, throughout our society. And acceptance of Hamas narratives like that, about Gaza, about so-called genocide, and about Israel being an apartheid state, things that are on their face simply not merely untrue, but by any reasonable definition, looking at the broad scope of Jewish history, are bloodlines that are put forward to demonize and delegitimize Jews, not merely to sort of raise an argument, not to criticize a government in Israel. And of course, let's acknowledge of course, it isn't anti-Semitic to criticize the government in Israel. 10 million Israelis get up every day and criticize their government for one reason or another, the way that 335 million Americans get up every day and criticize their government for one way or another. What we're discussing is a war against the existence of a Jewish state, no matter who governs it, and quite frankly, no matter where its borders might be drawn. That is the issue that is on the table, and that is the issue that is motivating so much of our discussions about Israel, and so much of what the everyday coverage, not merely in the New York Times or on CNN, but in much of our media. And it has impacted not merely sort of the more liberal readership of the New York Times, but it has leached into the rest of society, with conservatives, people on the right, in their own idiosyncratic ways, echoing these same blood libels, mainstreaming them in different paths, in different sectors of society. That's how we know this is something that is broad and scary. Now, where does this come from? Where did it start? It didn't just start in terms of media bias. Media bias about Israel has been with us for a long time. Indeed, our discussion about media bias about Israel is fundamentally different today than it was had we discussed this when I was here 12 years ago, let alone 20, 30, or even 40 years ago, when the idea of anti-Israel media bias really became a topic of concern for us. Now, what do I mean by that? Journalists are storytellers. Let's start with that. And the easiest way to tell any story is from the point of view of an underdog. Now, had we, or rather said, were we to go back and go through the coverage of, say, the 1948 Israel War of Independence, which was not very heavily covered by the American media at the time, we would see most of the accounts were from from the point of view of the embattled Jewish state. They were the underdog. It was only a few years since the Holocaust. They were considered the good guys. The people trying to destroy them were, I would say rightly, viewed as the bad guys. Okay, that's fine. But as Israel won its wars of survival in its early years, the question of underdogs and sort of who was the David and who the Goliath changed. Israel did not fall when its enemies thought it would fall. It won those wars, difficult though they were, bloody though they were. And by the 1980s, Israel was seen as, well, it was powerful. It was no longer, the little David. It was depicted as the Goliath, as it struggled to deal with an ongoing effort to destroy it. And that is when journalists, sort of parachuting into the Middle East, began telling the story from a different point of view. Now, that is not to say that every negative story about Israel is untrue. Israel is a country. It's run by politicians in general. Its army is run by generals. Its government is run by politicians. They're as fallible as any politicians, any group of politicians in general, anywhere in the world. But what began to be clear was that there was a problem in covering it, because if you go in with the idea that it is in the wrong, you're just going to not necessarily be telling the story straight. Now, when we spoke of media bias in the 80s and 90s and in the early years of the 21st century, we were speaking of things that we might categorize as sloppiness, ignorance. Now, ignorance, well, the truth is most journalists don't really know a lot of history. In my business, what happened yesterday is history. What happened the day before yesterday is ancient history. Many journalists pride themselves on not really knowing a lot about the topics that they cover, because they can kind of dive in and tell a story. And that's kind of how it works. That's kind of how it has been in journalism for a long time. That's why I always urge young people who are interested in journalism not to study communications, but to study history, English, learn something about the world. Don't go in blind on everything, but many journalists did. And especially in the Middle East, people would often cover the Middle East, indeed almost all of them, without knowing the languages there. Up until recently, most correspondents of major networks did not speak Hebrew. Almost none of them spoke Arabic, and still today, most of them don't speak Arabic. And that makes them dependent on what we call fixers, people who would translate for them. And when they covered the territories, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, if you will, and Gaza, they were dependent on people who were generally approved by the Palestinian national movements, be it Fatah or Hamas, who kind of guided them in the direction they wanted to. I mean, honestly, they were only in Gaza before the October 7th war. There were only three kinds of journalists in Gaza. Basically, those who worked for Hamas, those who were afraid of Hamas, or those who were no longer living. That's the way news out of Gaza worked. And that includes people who were stringers there for the New York Times and for many other publications, for the AP, and they were often involved with, just as UNRWA and other agencies working from the UN working in Gaza, they were involved with the terrorist movements themselves. So that's a form of bias. The ignorance was a form of bias, and the editors were just as ignorant. And that gave rise to a movement within Americans, certainly the supporters of Israel, to monitor the media, to correct their mistakes. Groups like Camera, Honest Reporting, and they've done a great job for decades. And they often made some impact correcting mistakes. But when I say the discussion about media bias is different, it's because correcting those mistakes no longer matters as much, because the people making them are not primarily doing so because they're ignorant about the subjects, although many of them still are, or don't know the languages, or because they don't understand the history or the context. It's because they're doing so deliberately. Deliberately. Now that sounds like a big accusation. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about something that is actually bigger than our discussion of Israel and the media, even bigger than anti-Semitism. It's about a sea change in American education, which prioritized a way of thinking about the world, which saw everything from the lens, from the frame of reference of race and of power. Whereas, and we speak of it in other contexts of critical race theory, intersectionality, settler colonialism, ideas that were once marginal in American education but became mainstream in the academy principally over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. And they've come to dominate thinking in this country. So we are graduating people out of our universities who have just gone through, they aren't necessarily even political activists, who have been trained to think of the world in terms of this power structure in which the world is divided into the oppressed, who are generally considered people of color, and the oppressors, who are generally considered white oppressors. Now, what is this to do with Israel? Well, on the face of the facts, actually nothing. Anybody who knows anything about Israel knows that more than half of its population is, by the definitions of the American left, shall we say, are people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East and North Africa, or places like Ethiopia. The Jews, far from being an oppressor class, are historically among the most oppressed people in the world, within the living memory of people living today. That persecution is real. But they are identified as powerful. They are not weak. And if you divide the world up into this, and I hesitate to say it because it sounds like it has political overtones, but it is actually in the context, it's what it is. It's sort of neo-Marxist, in that if you think people who have power are evil, people who are successful are evil, the Jews are evil and oppressive. Israel is evil and oppressive. And sadly, this same debate that we are having in this country about many other issues, about race, whatever you think of that, good or bad, has been applied to Israel, to the Jews, and to somehow transform the most persecuted people, in modern history, into the oppressor class, into people whose grievances need not be considered, whose rights need not be considered because they're in conflict with people who are less powerful and therefore are always in the right no matter what they do, and the Jews and the Israelis are always in the wrong no matter what they do. Classic example of this is a famous writer, made famous in The Atlantic and other places, something of a literary star. His name is Ta-Nehisi Coates. And a couple of years ago, he took his first trip to the Middle East. He spent 10 days in what he says, he spent 10 days in Palestine, which is to say he spent 10 days in Israel and the territories. And he emerged from that to write a book about it. Now, since he spent less time there than many of you have spent on, say, missions with JNF or the federations, you would think that's a lot of chutzpah to be writing a book about it. And indeed, maybe you think his book agent is, his literary agent is a genius. And there's a touch of that too. But it kind of didn't matter that he had only, sort of toured through 10 days speaking to a few people, because he arrived there with his ideas about Israel and the conflict with the Palestinians firmly in place. He thought Israel was the moral equivalent, indeed the repeat of the Jim Crow South. Now, if he had actually spent any time in Israel and learned anything, Israel isn't perfect. It doesn't have to be. Why should it be perfect any place as much as any other place doesn't need to be perfect? But whatever its imperfections, it is not the Jim Crow South. It is not an apartheid state. It's a democracy. All of its citizens have rights. It's locked in a conflict with people who want to destroy it, and has created this sort of limbo in the territories about which we can argue what's the right solution or not. But he just said the Israelis are bigots, they're bad, they're just like the Jim Crow South. Now this is, just to put it in slight more context, this is a book that came out in October 2024, a year after October 7th. Yet nowhere in that book does the word Hamas appear. Nowhere in that book does the word terrorism appear. That's really something, right? Nowhere in that book is there any discussion of October 7th. Although after the fact, during his book tour, he admitted that he wished he had had the courage to be part of the October 7th massacres, to be among the people committing, mass murder, rape, torture, wanton destruction, kidnapping. Now, this book landed, as I say, at the end of 2024, and it became an instant hit, big seller, promoted everywhere. The one journalist who asked him even a slightly difficult question on CBS News was almost lynched by his colleagues for having the temerity of doing so. Now, does this particular book, which has about as much literary, historical, political value as, well, nothing. It has no political value. It has no real knowledge in it. But it's important, and we should remember it, because it is an example of how many people in the daily press, at major newspapers, at major networks, think about Israel. And indeed, it is how basically everybody coming out of the journalism schools, and that's where, unlike when I started in journalism with a history degree, God help me, which, as my father said, that's great, when you can open a history store. But he was right, I didn't. But this is how everybody who comes at, everybody who wants to work at a major outlet now has to come out with a journalism degree. And basically, as studies of those leaving journalism schools have shown, they're all immersed in this kind of ideology, in this very same kind of thinking. So what they're doing, what they have been trained to do, is activism, not journalism in the way that I was taught when I started. Which isn't so much a matter of dating me, but as much as objectivity is always it's a goal, it's an aspiration. For them, for this new generation of journalists, it's not an aspiration. In fact, it is what they are hoping to avoid, because they are more and more, and many of them are very open about it. The people in the newsroom at the Times, being a great example, many other publications. They see an obsession, just as Ta-Nehisi Coates did, an obsession with facts and trying to tell what actually happened from both sides in a dispute as wrong. Not merely something that you don't have to do, but as wrong because there's a right and a wrong. Activism guides you towards that journalism should be about helping the oppressed and fighting the oppressors. And if you want to know how it is, a newspaper like New York Times could publish a story about rapist dogs, Israeli rapist dogs, just to see, one crazy example. But there are many other examples. Go through how the post-October 7th war was covered in many ways. It comes down to this basic fact, that most of those who are doing the covering, who are editing them, who are talking about it on the networks, believe Israel is in the wrong. Not merely in the wrong in any specific incident, but that it is wrong. That the idea of a Jewish state is somehow wrong. And that those who oppose it, even when they do the most outrageous, horrible crimes, are somehow okay. And that is the only way, quite frankly, to explain the coverage of Israel after October 7th. Because immediately, even before Israel began its effort to root out Hamas in Gaza, Israel was viewed as being the bad guy after October 7th. It was something I think many in the Jewish community are still having trouble wrapping their heads around. How was that possible? Why was that possible? And my answer is, just talk to so many of the people who are involved in journalism today. That's what this is about. It is about these toxic ideas that have distorted so many other topics. You know, we can talk about it in the context of politics, and there's plenty of room for disagreement about racial issues in this country. But when you apply it here, it's not just about a war against, the West, the war against the Western civilization. It is also a war against the foundation, one of the foundations of the West, which is the Jewish people, Jewish knowledge, Jewish existence. And so many of the people who are attacking Israel, attacking the idea, indeed the idea of a Judeo-Christian heritage, are not merely, as I say, Marxists, but they're also people on the right. And I mentioned people like Tucker Carlson. This has filtered into society in a way that it has distorted the way we talk about our things, talking about everything. But specifically, it's how we talk about journalism and how we talk about journalism about Israel. These are areas that can't be corrected. So we're at a point where I sort of have bad news, worse news, and slightly good news for you about all this. The bad news is that media bias against Israel, media bias on the entire subject of anti-Semitism, which we have seen play out at universities, and not just at universities, where we know the encampments of people chanting for from the river to the sea, even if they don't know which two bodies of water they're talking about, calling for globalizing the Intifada, which means terrorism against Jews everywhere, which is echoed even now by some politicians, like the mayor of New York City. We're discussing this in a way that is worse than we've ever had. This is really bad. So what's the worst news than that? The worst news is when it comes to coverage of these issues of anti-Semitism here and bias against Israel there, it kind of can't be corrected. We can't really fix the New York Times right now, or some of the other publications that mainstream really toxic ideas that consider anti-Zionism, which is the denial of denying rights to Jews, that you would not think of denying to any other people or country. But let's face it, there is no other country that has an international movement dedicated to its destruction. There's no other people who are visited with this kind of discrimination. And yet that is, that would be considered abhorrent against any other minority group. It's now considered fair, not merely fair game, but considered what right-thinking people do. That those who defend anti-Semitism, those who promote these ideas, those who routinely talk of genocide, of Israel committing genocide, even though by no definition is Israel has committed genocide, and in fact, it is the other side that wants to commit genocide. It is Hamas's intention to commit genocide. And indeed, as so often throughout our history as the Jewish people, when they say what we're guilty of, that's what they want to do. So when that is being empowered by a movement that is not merely devoted to Jew hatred, but is about a way of thinking about a world that transcends ideas about Israel and Judaism and anti-Semitism, you kind of can't fix that. People who believe that aren't interested in having their errors corrected the way any normal journalist would have, much as they don't like it. It's a mistake business. It's an improvisation every day. Everybody in journalism makes mistakes because, it's the first draft of history, and all first drafts have errors in them. Whether it's misspelling, or you got a date wrong, or you can sometimes get a story wrong. But those who think of Israel, and those who think of the discussion of anti-Semitism, in the context where Israel and the Jews are the bad guys, always in the wrong, and their opponents, even those who committed mass murder and rape and kidnapping on October 7th, that they're actually the good guys. They're just breaking free of their chains, as the head of one school said in her comments after October 7th, then you can't fix them. So what's the slightly good news? The slightly good news, I wouldn't call it unabashed good news, is that most of the mainstream media, as influential as it is, whether you're talking about any of the major newspapers or the networks, they don't have the sway that they once did. As important as they are, and as much as their footprint is impacted, they are no more impactful than any nutcase podcaster or somebody who posts a lot on social media with 1 million or more followers. Now, that's not unalloyed good news, because that means that nutcases like Hassan Piker on the left and Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson on the right, they have huge followings. They can impact more people than mainstream newspapers can. That's what's scary. If you want to know what's fueling the poll results about anti-Semitism that show the younger you are, the more likely you are to not only believe that Israel is this demonized country, but that anti-Semitism is somehow okay, it's because of the influence of new media. But that also gives the opportunity for other kinds of new media, which can, difficult although the task may be, tell the truth. That's kind of my job. That's where I started out with JNS. Again, like Israel, we're not perfect, but we're trying. And wherever you see new media, where people are not guided by these same ideas, where not everybody there in their newsroom is coming out, coming from a place where ideology is what matters, rather than knowledge, history, facts. That's the kind of media to support. It exists. There are places like the Free Press. There are many others. I'm not going to give endorsements willy-nilly, but the onus is on you, the consumers of media, to seek out truthful things. And that puts more responsibility on you than you used to have, because it used to be we were all just fed what the journalism establishment wanted us to believe. But that's where we are. Now, how do we as a community fight this? Now, number one, I think we should support honest media. But we must also understand that in this struggle, our obligation is to follow what is, I think, at the essence of Jewish identity throughout our history. Since the time of the Maccabees to today, I believe the essence of being a Jew has always been to refuse to bow down to the idols of popular culture. In past eras, that was Hellenism, the Roman Empire, a universal church. In the 20th century, it became Marxism, Nazism, fascism. Islamism is another force. And today we're dealing with what we might, for lack of a better term, call wokeism. This idea of looking at the world in the West through this power idea of good guys and bad guys, that everything is divided on race and power. We have to push back against it. And in order to do this, we need not just the facts and the truth, but we do. It used to be, APAC used to put out a book every year called Myths and Facts about the Middle East. And we still need to do that. They don't publish the book, but there are ways of learning what was in there, and there are plenty of sources for that. But we need something else as a community that is just as important, in fact, I think far more important, and that is courage. The courage to stand up against what the establishment says. The courage to stand up against what the academic establishment that has enshrined these ideas in our culture, against the cultural establishment that has integrated into everything that they do, and against members of our political class, the governing class, who have adopted these same toxic ideas, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, against media establishments, whether they are consider themselves to be on the right or on the left. We have to push back against them. We have to speak truth to all kinds of different power. And in order to do that, what we need is the self-confidence and the belief and the faith that we are in the right. You know, one of the things I get a lot of from questions from readers and listeners and viewers, and indeed, you know, if you're in journalism now, it's all about podcasts and listeners and viewers, not just readers, even though I always end my podcast telling people to keep reading. It is that we become passive. Well, we can't be passive anymore, not as a community. And if those organizations which have long spoke for us have adopted a passive attitude towards this problem, if they are telling not merely our kids who are in colleges, but us as a community to more or less shelter in place and not confront this evil, and it is evil. Wherever we find it, then they're in the wrong. We have to find the courage to stand up as a community, which is hard for people. It's hard for kids, it's just as hard for adults. But we must do so, because if we don't act, speak, think, do anything save but to remain silent, we will be complicit in what is, without a doubt, the greatest crisis the Jewish community in this country has ever faced. We are not here on sufferance. We are not here, from the earliest days of the Republic, Jews were not tolerated. They were accepted as equals, getting back to George Washington. And that has to do with Zionism too. You know, the first American president to endorse the idea of a Jewish state wasn't Harry Truman or Woodrow Wilson, it was John Adams. And when you remember that, you'll remember something else about this. And that in this fight, as daunting as it may appear, and it is daunting, and it is scary, we're not alone. We have many friends in this country. Many people are still decent and understand that what America stands for is a place not only where Jews have rights, but where ideas such as these toxic notions that empower those who lie and those who hate the West, who hate America, quite frankly, too, they don't like it either. And quite frankly, nobody voted for that. At least not anybody yet. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will. I'm not in the prediction business, but I still have faith in this country. I still have faith in the good sense and decency of the American people, hard as that may be to remember at times, especially times like ours. So let's speak up. Let's have the courage to do so. Let's be wise in the way that we consume media, but above all, don't be silent. If you are silent, you are complicit, and we cannot be complicit. And if we aren't, if we do find the courage to speak up, I believe with God's help, we will survive this, Israel will survive this, and it will be to our credit, to posterity. And that's what we should be thinking about. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. I just want to point out something I kind of assumed, but many of you don't know it. Jonathan works in this country. He visits Israel frequently, of course, because it's the Jewish News Syndicate, but his home base is here in Philadelphia, so he is involved with this country even more so, and that is an important concept when you're listening to what he's saying. It was an excellent discussion, excellent talk. Part of our problem, if I can sit up here without falling over, part of our problem is our own people. And I really want to explain something that Jews in this country have hooked onto as a negative about Israel, and that is something called settler violence, okay? Good, upstanding, intelligent Jewish people, never mind the rest of the country which may buy into this, but our own people hear this and they get disgusted at Israel. Let me just give you a couple of numbers. We're looking at 90% of the settler violence reports since 2016 up to 2023. 90% of settler violence is not settler, it is not violence, and it is not in Judea and Samaria. Settler violence includes visits to the Temple Mount. Settler violence includes historic site visits, infrastructure problems in projects in Judea and Samaria, like fixing roads. That's settler violence, especially in Area C. A primary school visit, young children to Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle first was in Eretz Israel. That's settler violence as well. And our own people buy into this. And the media, this is a gold mine for the media, because it's another way to stick it to Israel. I'm sorry, I'm upset. Would you please comment on that?
I guess we'll put a question mark at the end of that. I think it's very important for us when we discuss this issue, this specific issue, to separate your opinions or anybody's opinions about where Israel's borders should be, or about whether settlements should exist outside of the Green Line, the 1949 armistice lines, from whether there is settler violence. We can disagree, as Israelis do, about where the border should be. You could agree or disagree about whether the settlements, the places where Jews live outside the Green Line, should have been built. The question of whether the people who live there are incorrigibly violent is a separate one. Now, are some people who live in the settlements violent and criminal? Yeah, a few of them are. I would say probably in no higher proportion than the proportion of the population of Israel, which is violent and criminal. Some of them are politically motivated, but they're actually a tiny, tiny group. And what Alan was alluding to in his recitation of the statistics, which are part of the UN report about settler violence, is that the issue of whether the settlement should exist or not has been conflated about whether the people who live there are violent. And it is basically anything that people who live there do is construed as violence, including resisting when they are attacked themselves. Now, the truth is, if you visited or talk to people who live there, again, irrespective of your beliefs about where the border should be or what you think about Israeli politics, whether you identify with the left or whether you identify with the right there, the truth is, violence in the territories is daily, but the overwhelming majority of it is from the Palestinian Arabs against the Jews who live in the settlements. It's daily. It's a form of stone throwing, which sounds innocent, but if somebody throws a stone at you while you're driving on the road, that's attempted homicide. And indeed it has resulted in homicides. And, many other things. And if people resist that, when they're attacked, violently confronted, they're considered to have, to have committed settler violence. So I think what has happened with this idea is, and it's become a narrative about Israel, about the Jewish right in Israel, again, about which, we can agree or disagree. It's become kind of a false way of thinking about it, and it's become a way of delegitimizing Israel in a different way, and in a way that appeals to sort of, I think, a lot of American Jews who don't want to be identified with people with whom they may politically disagree, who think, that the settlement shouldn't exist, although, to be honest, in the context of Israel now, in the politics of Israel in 2026, it's very important to understand, and this is, and we're going to be talking a lot about this in the next few months. Israel is going to have an election, on October 27th, and you're going to hear both in the media and Jewish media, secular media, about the debate about who should run Israel in the next, when the next Knesset is elected. And again, I think they're going to be conflating two different issues. One is the issue of whether Benjamin Netanyahu should remain as prime minister. Israel's deeply divided on that. You know, he's a very polarizing figure, if for no other reason that he's been around forever. I mean, I think if anybody, you know, if Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush were still like leading one of our political parties today in this country, we'd say, there's something wrong with that. You know, like, come on, that has to be somebody else, right? But in fact, you know, Netanyahu became the leader of the Likud in 1993. That's 33 years ago, my gosh. I mean, I'm sure time flew for him, but for the rest of it, maybe not so much. And, you know, people can disagree about that. And they do. And a lot of people blame him for October 7th, which is not an unfair thing because it happened on his watch, even though he can, in his defense, trying to see it from both points of view, that was as much the military and the intelligence establishment's fault. And the truth is, none of his political opponents were advising him to do anything differently before October 7th. It's not like anybody in Israel wanted to go into Gaza to get rid of Hamas before October 7th. But leave that aside. There's a disagreement about whether he should continue, and he has a lot of people who love him, a lot of people who hate him. A lot of people who don't disagree with him but won't serve with him in government because they hate him. I'm talking about the heads of some of the different parties. But what there isn't disagreement, or at least general disagreement in Israel about, is whether we should, you know, whether Israel should adopt the policies that it adopted in the 90s, basically to work for a two-state solution and to try to trade land for peace. Outside of the very far left, nobody in Israel thinks that's, I mean, in fact, that's considered more or less insane, because they'll tell you that what existed in Gaza from 2005 until October 7th, 2023, was a Palestinian state in all but name. And instead of being an incubator for peace, as we all know, it became a terrorist fortress, you know, and they used the billions and billions of foreign aid to build what it was, is more or less the equivalent of the New York City subway system underneath it, which served as sort of a bomb shelter for the bombs and the bombers, in which ordinary people weren't allowed to go into. So more or less nobody who's opposing, nobody who is a conceivable alternative to Netanyahu is going to do anything different on the issues of war and peace. None of them are going to be pushing for a two-state solution that nobody, you know, more or less no one in that country thinks is even possible, and would be insane if they tried it, because if they withdraw from, you know, what many here call the West Bank, which is bigger and more strategic, you know, it's just a recipe for what Hamas says it will do if it gets the chance, which is more October 7th. That's not what's at stake in the Israeli elections. What's at stake is who's going to lead the country against those ideas. And that's what we have to understand. I mean, if Naftali Bennett or General Eisenkot, none of them are going to be agreeing with anybody in this country, whether they go there or preach it from Washington about a two-state solution. They're all going to say no to that, because that's just not that's the consensus in Israeli politics. They've been paying attention to what's happened over the last 30 years, what happened during the Second Intifada, what happened after the withdrawal from Gaza. So that's the context, not merely for the discussion of settler violence, but for the entire discussion about Israeli politics in this country, which I think a lot of people, including many in our own community, don't really understand.
It's frightening. Right now, in Belgium, I would be arrested because I'm a Mohel. A Mohel, a religious circumcisor. Two of these Mohelim were arrested in Belgium. This is how far the European community has come, how far it has been influenced by the influx that we heard when we had our 3 liberal Muslims here 2 weeks ago. How bad is this, okay? How can we continue to try and fight this? This is still part of the DEI concept, where the Jews are the powerful and bad people are white people, etc.
Well,
comment.
Well, I think what we're seeing specifically in Western Europe is this odd alliance, which we tended to call by the name of the Red-Green Alliance, basically Marxists or left-wingers making common cause with Islamists, many of whom have come into Europe in migration over the last 20, 25 years or more. And this has fueled a wave of anti-Semitism that puts even what has happened in this country, which is bad enough and has involved violence, including murders and targeting of Jews, puts it to shame. It is much worse in Europe. We hear over and over again from Jewish communities in places like France, in Britain, Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, where Jews no longer feel safe being openly identified as Jews. Now, we are not at that point yet in this country. I know there's a lot of pessimism and alarmism, some of which is not unjustified. When we've seen what happened on our college campuses, when we see what is mainstreamed in our discourse, we do right to be afraid and to be angry. But it has progressed to a very different, farther point in Europe. It has become mainstream. It really calls into question the viability of some of the Jewish communities, which are very old, very well established. And indeed, we're seeing echoes of it here. At times, it seems as if hatred for Israel is sort of an organizing principle of American politics. We see it on the far right with people like Tucker and Candace Owens and their neo-Nazi Groyper friend Nick Fuentes, where it's all about the Jews. Like, if what's wrong with Tucker? It's like he's obsessed with Israel. When he was on Fox News, I wrote this at the time because I didn't trust him, even though he was a very mainstream conservative figure and had earned the sort of the credibility on many other issues. The most mainstream Republicans supported him on other issues. But, between 8 and 9 p.m., I mentioned this to you, Alan, in conversation, and I wrote this at the time, when Tucker was on Fox News, between 8 and 9 p.m. was the hour when the word Israel was never mentioned on Fox. Otherwise, it's kind of very conventionally pro-Israel kind of conservative, but not him. And what is different about him since he was booted out of Fox and became, a star podcaster with a whole different, following and different kind of influence, is that he's just more or less obsessed with Israel. Like, go to his website if you want to, and it's like every week he has a new anti-Israel guest from one kind or another. Candace Owens, when she's not obsessing about, the wife of the president of France, she's spinning conspiracy theories about Jews. On the left, it's just as bad, if not worse, because we're seeing so many candidates, in fighting in Democratic primaries, and recently winning Democratic primaries, whose main credential is that they hate Israel. We're seeing a battle. We saw it in Maine with Graham Plattner, who's crashed and burned because finally someone came forward credibly accusing him of sexual violence, who couldn't be dismissed because she was a liberal activist. We see it in Michigan with Abdul El-Sayed, who's basically his main, if you watch the tape of his debate with Haley Stevens, a moderate Democrat, it's like his whole campaign is AIPAC. He thinks AIPAC and Israel and supporters of Israel in this country are the source of all evil in this country. He's got more than a fighting chance of winning that Democratic nomination. He may not, I have to say, I'm head of a nonprofit, I don't make political endorsements, but we have to hope somebody with those kind of ideas doesn't win, but he's got an even chance. And we've seen that in congressional districts around the country. In New York, a classic example, Representative Dan Goldman, who the last Jewish Democratic member representing New York City at one point, only 30 odd years ago, there were 7 of them. He's the last one. And you can't be any more of a liberal Democrat than him in today's context. On all the issues, he doesn't agree with conservatives on anything. He's the one who led one of the impeachment efforts against President Trump. Like, what better credentials do you have in the Democratic Party these days? He lost because he was considered pro-Israel. I mean, the truth is, he wasn't all that pro-Israel. He was very critical of Israel. He was not like an ardent, he wasn't a John Fetterman, for example, who is unabashedly pro-Israel, defending the government, attacking its opponents. Dan Goldman was he fit very much into his party on that issue. And yet, he was defeated by another Jew, but another Jew who accused Israel of genocide and ran against AIPAC, and all that. We're seeing this all over the country. Anti-Israel, and in fact, ideas, when I speak of Abdul al-Said and his obsession with AIPAC, there's no other way to call it, but it's anti-Semitism. It's the old Jews and money trope. The Jews are buying America. The Jews are buying the government. There's no way of thinking about this. This is a guy who, quite frankly, tried to excuse one of his would-be constituents who tried to bomb a synagogue in West Bloomfield, Michigan, and slaughter Jewish school children who were there. And he said, well, it's because of what Israel did in Lebanon, which is, come on, yes. The guy was related to Hezbollah terrorists, so therefore he should be excused. That's what we're facing. This anti-Israelism, which is just anti-Semitism by another name, has become an organizing principle of American politics. We can't accept that. And this is a battle that needs to be fought on both the left and the right. As I said at the start, don't let anybody convince you that this is a partisan issue. And there are people who are trying to convince us that, that it's just a partisan issue. It's just something Republicans care about, or it's just some other people that they don't like. No, this exists throughout our society, and it's got to be faced down everywhere. Because if not, we see what happens. It spreads. It's normalized. It's what happens. It's a country where the leading newspaper can print a lie about, a blood libel about rapist dogs trained by Jews, bless you, is a country where people who are obsessed about Jews get elected to the Senate and the House, and possibly to the presidency someday. We can't let that happen. We have to fight it whatever we find it.
Questions, please. And please try and make it a question. Talk clearly.
When Nicholas Kristof's first article got printed in the Times, the one about dog rape, I was horrified. And then he doubled down and got another article published several days later. And I wondered, why was there no response from Jews from the Jewish community? And my question is, the Jewish community is very well organized. We know about Federation and all the money is spent. Why don't we have a section, a department, that is doing some of this?
Okay, that's a good
would
question.
have refuted Nicholas Kristof.
Well, to be fair, a lot of Jews tried to do exactly what you're saying. And even some of those in mainstream organizations like the ADL, of which, quite frankly, I've been very critical at times. Don't necessarily invite me and Jonathan Greenblatt to the same cocktail party. He's not very fond of me. But he tried to refute it. Many others in the Jewish community, local activists organized demonstrations outside the Times offices on 42nd Street, across from the transit center there. But it wasn't enough. It was very weak, it was disorganized, and part of the problem is the way our community is set up. We are divided. No, we don't speak with one voice about anything, and that's partly because this is self-selected, it's democracy. We're divided by politics, bitterly divided by politics, as are most Americans. And our organizations our leading organizations have for too long, and this is me criticizing them, been too much interested in normal partisan politics and too much concerned with staying in sync with their old allies, all of whom turned on us after October 7th, and were not interested in fighting for Jewish rights, just as the Jewish community fought for the rights of other communities. And so there is no, if all of our major organizations, and forgive me if I'm mentioning some of your favorite organizations, whether it's the ADL or the AJ Committee, who quite frankly, I don't even know what their job is anymore. I know the ADL still has a job. Most national Jewish organizations were created to solve the problems of the turn of the 20th century, of 1900 and 1920, which have long ago been solved. They don't really have a job anymore. The ADL has a job. Anti-Semitism is as bad as it's ever been. They've spent too much of the last, certainly the last 10 years since Abe Foxman resigned, although Abe and I had our disagreements, but he was, we also agreed on a lot. They've all spent too much time playing politics and being involved in other issues and not being laser focused on their one job, which is defending the Jews, fighting anti-Semitism wherever it is, whether it's on the left or on the right, which is where most of us used to think where it solely resided. That's a big difference now. It's just as, if not more deeply entrenched on the left today because of these toxic ideas that I discussed earlier. Our organizations aren't built to fight that fight. And too much of the money that we as a community have invested is not in the fight that we need to fight today. It's on all these old battles that really aren't to the point anymore. So when we're faced with something as egregious as Nicholas Kristof's blood libel, not only is the news media not up in arms about it, like other media didn't, other than JNS or some people who normally criticize the Times about anything else. There was no, their competitors, their would-be competitors, the Washington Post didn't blast them, because they're kind of doing the same thing. It's spread throughout the culture, and we need to reorient ourselves as a community to fight the battles of today. As I said before, part of that involves in supporting media that tells the truth as opposed to supporting, as many Jews still do, as many Jews still think the New York Times is the Bible. They are its hardcore audience. It's built for the credentialed elites. That's us. It used to, the Times, 50, 60 years ago, conceived of itself as a mainstream paper to appeal to all points of the spectrum. That is not how it conceives of itself today. Its business plan is to appeal only to the left, which turns out is actually a very good business because, the credentialed elites that they appeal to have a lot of the money. It's Wall Street. Politics has shifted a lot. For good or for ill. Used to be working. The Democrats seem to be more or less the working class party, and the Republicans were the Wall Street party. Democrats are kind of the Wall Street party in some ways, and thanks to Trump, whatever you think of Trump, the Republicans are now appealing more to the main dividing. Interesting statistics from 2024. The division on Republicans and Democrats was on education levels. The Times, you want to understand the Times. I cite this often when I speak of media bias and when I talk about specifically of the Times. It's think of an issue of their style magazine, upscale stuff, right? And the cover story was a profile of Angela Davis, who, whether I don't see some people nodding, basically a communist activist, a retread from, the 60s and 70s. On the back cover of that magazine was an ad for a Cartier watch. That's who the Times thinks it's writing for. Too many Jews are still supporting that kind of journalism, and you shouldn't be surprised when that leads to stuff like what happened with Nick Kristof, which it was so bad that a week or two ago, the news editor of the Times, Joe Kahn, was himself a person of the left, don't get me wrong, was asked, because this was published as opinion, even though it was, highlighted and made a big deal, and should be subjected, as we do in my organization or any credible organization, to the same fact checks the news article should be subjected to. He said, when asked if he would have run that, he said no, but his publisher overridden him. The Sulzbergers were fine with it. They defended it. So that's
the Jewish Sulzbergers.
Well, they haven't been. The Sulzbergers were Jewish 100 years ago. They actually haven't been Jewish by any definition of Jewish for a couple of generations, to be fair to them. They have a Jewish sounding name, but they aren't really Jewish.
American medicine has gotten to a point now that people researching different cancers, different autoimmune diseases in different centers of research around the country have finally begun to work together to try and conquer these diseases or these specific cancers. And we've made incredible headway with this. And I can speak to that personally. Why can't the Jewish organizations in this country sit down, stop with, I raised more money than your organization back and forth, which is useless to what we are dealing with now? Why can't they sit down and do something like American medical research?
Well, it's kind of a whole lecture for a different evening. But the short answer is, because too many of the people who lead the organizations don't want to. It's nobody's priority, at least nobody important enough to push them. There are some people who care about it. Obviously, they've been trying, but they have been largely marginal to many of the people, what we call the Jewish establishment, what we call the Jewish leadership. I think that is starting to change. And just as the Jewish community, the established Jewish community, has changed in many ways. 35 years ago, very few people in the organized Jewish world cared that much about Jewish education. Then they started seeing some of the demographic studies, which showed Jews assimilating themselves out of existence. And a lot of people thought, well, if this continues, nobody will be around to pay my salary, so I guess I should care about Jewish education. And we started investing more in Jewish education and trips to Israel and Jewish camps. But the damage had already been done. Maybe in the next 10 to 20 years, there'll be a similar wake up within the organized Jewish world. But again, the damage has been largely done. We have been asleep as a community. Our leadership has been asleep, and that's what happened. Yeah. There's also somebody up here. We'll try to get to everybody. I'm not going anywhere, so.
Hi, thank you for everything you're saying. How do you respond when somebody says, well, the reason October 7th happened is because the Jewish state has treated people so unfairly and they've caused the fervor, the anger, the hatred, the violence? How do you respond? Because so many of our friends say that, and I would love to hear your response.
The reason why that narrative is wrong is that it basically just looks at the problem of the conflict between Israel and the Arabs, Israel and Palestinian Arabs, from a Jewish point of view. As if it's like if you were watching a sports contest in which one team was on the field and the other team was invisible. Because to say that the Palestinians committed October 7th and all the other terrorism over the years, the Second Intifada, whatever, because the Jews have been mean to them, is to ignore and to deny agency to the Palestinians. Because anybody who knows even the outline of the history of the Middle East over the course of the last century would come to the conclusion that the basically motivating factor, the whole guiding force of Palestinian national identity has been an effort to deny the Jews their own state. At every point, I'm not going to give you all a history lecture here. You can go look it up. From the 1930s on, the Jews have offered compromises as past peace The two-state solution didn't start with Bill Clinton. It was tried in the 30s by the British. And at every point, from the 1930s when, the Mufti of Jerusalem was the leader of the Palestinians, later, well known for his, stay in Berlin during World War II, the Palestinians have said, no thank you very much. We do not want an Arab state alongside Israel or alongside the Jews. We want no Jewish state. That was their reaction to the UN Partition Agreement in 1947, which called for a Jewish state and an Arab state. That was their reaction to every single thing that has happened since then, including, efforts, when Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak went to Camp David in 2000 and offered Yasser Arafat, who had already been given control of Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and said, we'll give you a state in 95% of the territories and a share of Jerusalem. His answer was no. And again in 2001, and again in 2008 when Abbas was the one. And every time, Barack Obama spent 8 years trying to tilt the diplomatic playing field in the direction of the Palestinians to push them to accept a Palestinian state alongside Israel. And every time their answer is no, we don't want a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Hamas is very explicit about it. What they want is the destruction of the Jewish state, the genocide of the Jewish population in Israel. That's why they attacked on October 7th. Not because they were occupied, because in fact in Gaza they weren't occupied. Israel had withdrawn every settler, soldier, and settlement from Gaza in 2005. It's not because the Jews have been mean to them, it's because they don't want a Jewish state. That is what the Palestinian national movement has been dedicated to. I don't say this as they're bad people. I'm just describing reality. And you can deny that if you want to. But if you do, you're denying them their agencies. You're just ignoring them and what they've said and how they've acted. All these, the lack of peace, in the 1990s, there were plenty of people who were in Israel and some in the American Jewish community who thought the Oslo Accords were a terrible idea, it'll never work. They were the minority. They were the minority inside of Israel. They were certainly a minority here. But they're no longer the minority in Israel because Arafat proved he didn't want peace. He answered peace offers, even the state that people say they want, with a terrorist war of attrition called the Second Intifada. He had, and since then there's October 7th. That's why there's virtually no constituency for a two-state solution in Israel, because they've been paying attention to that, and many American Jews haven't.
That's not her answer to that question.
So I appreciate that, and I guess since you are a history major, you go to history, and that's very important, but I think Tracy and I are friends, and the question usually comes up in social situations where you don't have 5 minutes to give that kind of response. And what I like to do is, what's really important is that people understand, a lot of people, the question comes out of ignorance, so a lot of people don't understand that there are Arabs who live in Israel. They don't know that. But you can't tell them that, because that can cause a backfire effect. So, Tracy, this is how I would respond. I would say, don't you think it's a tragedy that there are so many Arabs who live just on the other side of the border of Israel, who don't have the same rights, opportunity, and prosperity as Arab Israelis have? And then they have to own the answer to that question. Oftentimes, and this just happened to me 2 weeks ago, oftentimes they'll say, I don't know that that's the case. I didn't know there were Arab Israelis. And then once you get them to own that, then they have to reckon with the fact that Arab Israelis, they're in the Knesset, the political parties, the Supreme Court, they have, some of them died on October 7th or were hostages. And then they have to reckon with the fact that there are Arabs in Israel who are satisfied for the most part satisfied in Israel. Why aren't they outside of Israel? And I think that's
That's a very good point. That's a good talking point for us. Our problem is that too many people don't want to listen. Honestly, partly it's ignorance. I mean, it's kind of the same deal, and we have to keep trying. But it's partly the same deal with the media. If you've been indoctrinated into thinking that one side is the bad guy, you don't really care. You're a Ta-Nehisi Coates. You don't care about the history. You don't care about anything. That is the most frightening thing. When we're confronted with mere ignorance, this is when we were confronted with media bias, merely rooted in ignorance and sloppiness, it was much easier to do something about it.
Just
Too much of our ignorance is not about that.
a question. You look at what's
Jonathan,
Europe. Wait,
thank you.
Very quickly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.